The Berlin Tunnel. Digging into Soviet secrets. Berlin, the city of spies. In the aftermath of World War II, few places embodied the tension of the Cold War like Berlin. Divided into four sectors controlled by the victorious Allies, the city became a crucible where East and West collided daily. The Americans, British, and French controlled the western half, while the Soviet Union dominated the East. The result was a city that was not only physically split, but also ideologically divided. Two worlds facing each other across barbed wire, checkpoints, and watchtowers. Berlin was a paradox. On the surface, life went on. Trams clattered through the streets, markets bustled with trade, and children played in the ruins of a city still scarred by war. Yet beneath that fragile normality lurked a darker truth. Berlin was the epicenter of espionage, a city where every cafe might shelter an informant, every office could hide a bug, and every alley might witness a clandestine meeting. Spies from both sides flooded the city, their missions ranging from gathering political intelligence to tracking troop movements. For intelligence services, Berlin was a gold mine, a front line where secrets were as valuable as bullets. The Americans and British quickly realized that one of the most valuable assets they could access was Soviet communication. The Red Army and the Soviet government relied heavily on underground cables running beneath East Berlin to coordinate their military operations and political strategy. If those cables could be tapped, the West would gain a direct line into the heart of Soviet intentions. But how to reach them? The answer was audacious: build a tunnel. The idea was simple in concept, but staggering in execution. From the American sector, engineers would dig a tunnel under the heavily guarded border into East Berlin. There, they would tap into the Soviet communication cables, siphoning off conversations, military orders, and classified reports, all without the Soviets ever knowing. It would be one of the boldest espionage projects of the Cold War. To outsiders, the plan sounded like something from a spy novel, but for the CIA and MI6, it was deadly serious. The risks were immense. Construction would have to be carried out in absolute secrecy, with workers sworn to silence and cover stories devised to mask the noise and activity. Any slip, any suspicious movement could expose the project and trigger a diplomatic crisis. Or worse, violent confrontation in the streets of Berlin. Yet in the fevered atmosphere of the early 1950s, the gamble seemed worth it. The Cold War was entering one of its most dangerous phases. The Korean War had just demonstrated how quickly proxy conflicts could spiral out of control. Stalin's death had left uncertainty about the future of Soviet leadership. In Washington and London, the need for accurate intelligence on Soviet capabilities and intentions was more urgent than ever. Thus, beneath the watchful eyes of Soviet border guards and patrols, a secret city began to take shape under Berlin. Engineers, intelligence officers, and laborers worked tirelessly, carving a hidden passageway that would become a symbol of both Western ingenuity and Cold War audacity. To the citizens above, Berlin was a divided city, tense but alive. To those in the know, it was something more. A battlefield beneath the ground, where the war for secrets was fought in silence. The Berlin Tunnel would come to be known as Operation Gold, a name that reflected the immense value of the intelligence it was meant to deliver. It was bold, risky, and unprecedented. And though the tunnel itself would one day collapse into scandal and betrayal, its story began here. In a city where every street corner whispered of espionage, and where beneath the rubble of a ruined world, a new kind of war was being fought. The birth of Operation Gold. The Berlin Tunnel was born not in Berlin itself, but in the minds of intelligence officers in Washington and London. By the early 1950s, both the CIA and Britain's MI6 had grown increasingly desperate to pierce the Soviet veil. Despite the enormous presence of spies in Berlin, much of the information being gathered was fragmentary, based on rumors, defectors, or the occasional intercepted courier. What Western leaders needed was something more reliable: direct access to Soviet communications. It was the British who first proposed the idea. MI6, drawing inspiration from a similar post-war operation in Vienna, where Western forces had successfully tapped Soviet lines, suggested that a tunnel could give them unprecedented access to Red Army cables in Berlin. The CIA, still a relatively young agency eager to prove itself, embraced the idea with enthusiasm. Together, they set out to plan what would become one of the boldest espionage operations of the Cold War. The target was clear: a series of underground communication cables running from Soviet military headquarters in East Berlin to Moscow. These lines carried orders, intelligence, and political instructions, exactly the kind of information the West craved. If tapped successfully, the tunnel could provide a treasure trove of secrets, allowing Washington and London to peer directly into the mind of their greatest adversary. But the plan was fraught with challenges. Digging a tunnel more than 400 meters long under the most surveilled city in Europe was no small task. Every movement, every sound risked exposure. To conceal the construction, the CIA built a warehouse disguised as a signal facility in the American sector. From there, engineers could work undercover, digging night and day while maintaining the illusion of routine activity. The project was codenamed Operation Gold, a reflection of the intelligence riches it was expected to yield. Construction began in 1954. The work was grueling. The soil of Berlin was unstable, waterlogged, and prone to collapse. Specialized machinery had to be imported, and every piece brought in under the cover of secrecy. Workers labored in cramped, claustrophobic conditions, often in near silence to avoid drawing attention. Even the disposal of excavated earth posed a risk. Every shovel of dirt had to be hidden or disguised to prevent suspicion from Soviet patrols. To tap the Soviet cables, engineers devised a complex system of listening posts. The cables themselves carried multiple lines, and the process of attaching taps without disrupting service required extraordinary precision. Once connected, the lines were routed back through the tunnel to the American sector, where banks of recording equipment and translators stood ready to capture and analyze the flow of Soviet messages. Operation Gold was not just about engineering, it was about trust. Only a handful of top CIA and MI6 officials knew the full scope of the project. Workers were compartmentalized, sworn to secrecy, and told only what they needed to know. Even within Western intelligence circles, rumors circulated about a mysterious project in Berlin, but few knew the truth. Despite the risks, progress continued. By 1955, the tunnel was nearly complete, stretching from the American sector deep into East Berlin. The final taps were connected, and for the first time, Western intelligence had a direct line into Soviet communications. To those who had conceived the operation, it was nothing short of a triumph. The CIA and MI6 had pulled off the impossible, a hidden passageway beneath the Iron Curtain, turning Berlin's soil into a conduit for secrets. Operation Gold was celebrated within the intelligence community as a masterpiece of ingenuity and daring. But even as the first Soviet messages flowed into Western hands, a shadow hung over the project, one that few in the CIA or MI6 yet suspected. For even as Operation Gold began delivering intelligence, another story was unfolding in parallel, a betrayal that would ultimately decide the tunnel's fate. Life beneath the ground. The Berlin Tunnel was not just an engineering marvel, it was a world of its own, a hidden artery pulsing beneath the divided city. For those who worked on it, life beneath the ground was a blend of claustrophobic hardship, constant danger, and the surreal knowledge that they were digging directly under the feet of their adversaries. Construction began in earnest in 1954, with the CIA establishing a nondescript warehouse on the edge of Berlin's American sector. Officially, the building was a simple signal facility, its hum of activity explained as routine communications work. In reality, it was the entrance to a covert project of astonishing ambition. From inside, workers descended into the earth, slowly carving a tunnel that would stretch nearly half a kilometer into East Berlin. The conditions were brutal. The soil of Berlin was heavy with clay and groundwater, making every meter of progress a battle against nature itself. Pumps constantly drained water from the shaft, while engineers reinforced the walls with steel and timber to prevent collapse. The air inside the tunnel was damp, musty, and thick with dust. Workers toiled in confined spaces where temperatures swung from freezing cold in winter to stifling heat in summer. Noise discipline was critical. At all times, silence had to be maintained to avoid alerting Soviet patrols above. Machinery was muffled, tools were wrapped in cloth, and conversations were kept to whispers. Every thud of a hammer or rumble of a drill carried the risk of discovery. To disguise the sounds, the CIA arranged for heavy vehicles to pass near the site during the loudest work, masking the vibrations of the tunnelers below. The workers themselves lived double lives. By day, they appeared to be ordinary technicians, laborers, or soldiers. By night, they descended into the earth, continuing a project that could not be acknowledged to anyone outside their tight circle. Most were not told the full truth of what they were building, only that it was critical for national security. The secrecy weighed heavily, but the sense of mission kept them going. When the taps were finally connected to the Soviet cables, life beneath the ground shifted from digging to listening. Inside the tunnel, teams of technicians monitored the wires, carefully capturing streams of Soviet military and political communications. The data was relayed back through the tunnel to the American sector, where translators and analysts worked around the clock. For the first time, the West could eavesdrop directly on the Red Army's nerve center. The operation yielded remarkable insights. Reports suggest that Operation Gold intercepted thousands of conversations and messages, ranging from routine logistics to high-level discussions. The intelligence painted a clearer picture of Soviet troop movements, supply chains, and political directives. To the analysts in Washington and London, the tunnel was delivering exactly what they had hoped for: a torrent of secrets straight from behind the Iron Curtain. But life beneath the ground was never free of tension. Every creak of the tunnel's walls, every unexplained vibration, brought fear that the Soviets might have discovered the operation. Rumors circulated among the workers about possible detection, about patrols above taking suspicious interest in the warehouse. Yet the work continued, month after month, fueled by the hope that the intelligence gathered would justify the enormous risks. For those who spent countless hours in the tunnel, the experience left lasting impressions. The claustrophobia, the constant sense of danger, and the surreal knowledge that they were trespassers beneath enemy soil made Operation Gold unlike any mission before or since. The tunnel was more than a passageway. It was a microcosm of the Cold War itself. Dark, secretive, dangerous, and utterly dependent on silence. And yet, even as Western intelligence celebrated its success, the fate of the Berlin Tunnel had already been sealed. Unbeknownst to the men laboring in its damp corridors, the Soviets knew of its existence almost from the very beginning. For life beneath the ground was not just about digging for secrets. It was about playing out a drama whose ending had already been decided by betrayal. The betrayal. George Blake, The double agent. For all its ingenuity and daring, Operation Gold carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. From the very beginning, the tunnel was compromised, not by Soviet patrols or suspicious noises, but by a man who walked freely through the halls of British intelligence, George Blake. Blake was no ordinary spy. Born in the Netherlands and raised partly in Egypt, he had joined Britain's MI6 during World War II and quickly proved himself capable and resourceful. But Blake's experiences as a prisoner during the Korean War reshaped his worldview. Witnessing the devastation of Western bombing campaigns and enduring harsh captivity, he embraced communist ideology. Upon his release, he returned to MI6, outwardly loyal but secretly committed to serving the Soviet Union. In 1953, as the plans for the Berlin Tunnel were being finalized, Blake was already a trusted officer with access to sensitive information. The moment he learned of Operation Gold, he passed word directly to the KGB. It was one of the most devastating breaches of Western intelligence in the entire Cold War. Moscow now knew, even before the first shovels struck the soil, that the West was preparing to dig beneath Berlin. The KGB faced a difficult decision. To expose the plot immediately would have been to reveal Blake, one of their most valuable double agents. Protecting him was paramount. So instead, the Soviets allowed the project to continue, aware that every cable tapped, every message intercepted would eventually be compromised. In effect, they turned the tunnel into a tool of disinformation, feeding carefully curated intelligence while keeping a close watch on the West's methods. Meanwhile, in Washington and London, the operation was celebrated as a triumph. Analysts pored over transcripts of Soviet communications, convinced they had struck gold. Little did they know that some of what they were reading had been deliberately shaped by Moscow. For Blake, the irony was exquisite. He had delivered his Western colleagues a treasure trove of secrets, while ensuring the Soviets controlled the narrative all along. The betrayal remained hidden for years. Workers risked their lives in the tunnel, unaware that the Soviets were already aware of their every move. Engineers marveled at their success, not realizing it had been permitted by the very adversaries they sought to deceive. And the intelligence community congratulated itself, blind to the fact that their prize had been poisoned from the start. It was not until 1961, years after the tunnel had been exposed, that Blake's treachery came fully to light. His arrest sent shockwaves through MI6 and the CIA, exposing the depth of the compromise. By then, the damage was incalculable. Not only had Operation Gold been fatally undermined, but countless other operations had been betrayed by Blake's steady stream of information to the KGB. The story of George Blake is a reminder of one of the Cold War's harshest lessons. The most dangerous threats to any intelligence operation often come not from outside, but from within. The Berlin Tunnel was not undone by Soviet vigilance or Western miscalculation. It was undone by a single man, a double agent whose quiet treachery cast a shadow over one of the most ambitious spy projects in history. In the end, the tunnel's fate was sealed not in the mud and clay beneath Berlin, but in the whispered conversations of a British officer who had chosen the other side. Discovery and collapse. By 1956, the Berlin Tunnel had been in operation for nearly a year. To the CIA and MI6, it was a marvel of ingenuity, a clandestine pipeline funneling Soviet secrets straight into Western hands. Thousands of conversations and military dispatches had been recorded, filling shelves with reels of tape. Intelligence officers in Washington and London celebrated the operation as a resounding success. Yet all along, the Soviets were merely waiting for the right moment to end the charade. The official story of the tunnel's discovery is almost theatrical. In April 1956, after heavy rainfall, Soviet repair crews supposedly stumbled upon the tunnel while conducting routine maintenance on underground cables. With dramatic flair, they exposed the operation to the world. Moscow denounced it as a blatant act of Western aggression, a violation of international law, and proof of capitalist treachery. Photographs of the tunnel's interior were splashed across newspapers, turning what had been a secret triumph for the CIA into a global embarrassment. But behind the propaganda, the truth was more complex. The Soviets had known about Operation Gold from the very beginning, thanks to George Blake's betrayal. The question was not whether to expose the tunnel, but when. By 1956, the KGB judged that enough intelligence had been harvested and enough disinformation had been fed that the operation had served its purpose. The carefully staged discovery allowed them to shut it down while preserving Blake's cover. To the outside world, it looked like a sudden Soviet victory. In reality, it had been orchestrated all along. For the West, the collapse of the tunnel was devastating. Publicly, Washington and London played down the damage, insisting that the intelligence gained had been worth the risk. Privately, however, officials were shaken. How much of the information they had intercepted was genuine? How much had been deliberately planted by the Soviets to mislead them? The very foundation of their analysis was called into question. The exposure also had diplomatic consequences. The Soviets seized on the tunnel as a propaganda coup, portraying themselves as victims of Western deceit. The timing was no accident. By revealing the tunnel when they did, Moscow reinforced its narrative of righteous vigilance against imperialist aggression. The CIA and MI6, for their part, endured the humiliation of seeing one of their most ambitious projects paraded before the world as a failure. Yet even in collapse, Operation Gold retained a strange dual legacy. On one hand, it was a glaring reminder of the vulnerability of intelligence operations to betrayal. On the other, it did produce valuable intelligence during its brief life. Analysts later concluded that much of the material gathered was genuine and had provided significant insight into Soviet military logistics. The tunnel may have been compromised, but it was not entirely in vain. Still, the sense of loss lingered. For the men who had dug through clay and groundwater, who had risked discovery and endured claustrophobic nights beneath East Berlin, the exposure was a bitter ending. What had once felt like a triumph of ingenuity now seemed tainted, a symbol of misplaced trust and unseen treachery. The discovery of the Berlin Tunnel was not simply the end of an operation. It was a revelation of the deeper, more dangerous truth of the Cold War. That espionage was always a game of mirrors, where victories could be illusions, and the line between success and failure blurred by betrayal. Legacy of the Berlin Tunnel. When the Berlin Tunnel was finally sealed and abandoned, its story did not end. Instead, it became one of the most enduring legends of the Cold War, a tale of ambition, ingenuity, and betrayal that continues to fascinate historians and intelligence professionals alike. The tunnel's legacy is complex. It was at once a triumph of engineering, a valuable source of intelligence, and a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities of espionage. From a technical standpoint, Operation Gold was a remarkable achievement. Building a half-kilometer tunnel beneath one of the most heavily surveilled cities in the world was a feat of both engineering and secrecy. The project required meticulous planning, careful deception, and extraordinary discipline from the workers and officers involved. In terms of sheer audacity, it demonstrated the lengths to which Western intelligence agencies were willing to go in their struggle against the Soviet Union. In terms of intelligence, the operation was not the total failure it is sometimes portrayed as. Despite the Soviets' knowledge of the tunnel, much of the information intercepted was genuine. analysts gained insight into Soviet troop movements, supply routes, and organizational structures. These details helped shape NATO's understanding of its adversary and provided a clearer picture of the Red Army's posture in Europe. For a period, the tunnel did deliver the gold it was designed to find. Yet the darker side of the legacy lies in the betrayal that haunted the project. George Blake's treachery exposed the vulnerability of even the most carefully guarded operations. For the CIA and MI6, the realization that their triumph had been compromised from the start was a bitter lesson in humility. It underscored a truth that would echo throughout the Cold War. The greatest threat to an intelligence operation often comes not from enemy patrols or technical failures, but from the insiders who choose to betray. The tunnel also left its mark on the culture of espionage. For Western intelligence, it became both a cautionary tale and a badge of honor. Cautionary because it showed how easily success could be undermined by a single act of treason. Honorable because it demonstrated what was possible when determination and ingenuity combined, even in the most hostile of circumstances. The Berlin Tunnel entered the lore of intelligence history, studied in classrooms and training programs as both inspiration and warning. For the Soviets, the tunnel was a propaganda victory that reinforced their narrative of constant vigilance against Western aggression. The staged discovery allowed Moscow to parade the West's failure before the world while protecting one of their most valuable agents. In this sense, the tunnel became a tool not only of intelligence, but of perception, shaping how both sides viewed the conflict and each other. Today, little remains of the Berlin Tunnel itself. Its physical structure has long since collapsed or been destroyed, buried beneath the modern city. But its legacy endures in books, archives, and the collective memory of the Cold War. It is remembered as a symbol of the Shadow War that defined that era, a conflict fought not just with armies and weapons, but with shovels, wires, and whispers in the dark. Above all, the Berlin Tunnel's legacy is a reminder of the paradox of espionage. It was at once a stunning success and an utter failure, a source of invaluable intelligence and a tool of enemy manipulation. In the secret war beneath Berlin, victory and defeat existed side by side, inseparable and indistinguishable. That paradox is the true lesson of Operation Gold, and the reason its story continues to resonate to this day. The City Beneath the City. The story of the Berlin Tunnel is more than an episode of espionage. It is a metaphor for the Cold War itself. A hidden passage carved beneath the streets of a divided city, it symbolized a conflict fought not in open battlefields, but in the shadows, where secrets mattered more than soldiers, and whispers carried the weight of bombs. For the people of Berlin in the 1950s, life was defined by visible divisions: the barbed wire, the checkpoints, the armed guards glaring across invisible borders. But the tunnel revealed another layer of the city, one that ordinary citizens never saw. Beneath their feet, an invisible war was being waged. Engineers, spies, and analysts lived double lives, balancing the mundane routines of peacetime with the clandestine urgency of an underground battlefield. The city itself became a stage, its surface hiding the silent drama below. In this way, the Berlin Tunnel is a reminder that the Cold War was not only about tanks, missiles, and nuclear arsenals. It was about the battle for knowledge. Each side sought to pierce the other's secrets, to predict intentions, to gain even the slightest edge in a standoff, where the margin for error was annihilation. The tunnel represented that hunger for information, an act of desperation as much as daring, born of fear as much as ambition. And yet, for all its promise, the tunnel's fate showed the fragility of espionage. A single betrayal turned triumph into tragedy, reducing months of labor and millions of dollars into a carefully managed Soviet spectacle. In the end, Operation Gold became a story less about engineering brilliance than about human weakness. The reality that even the most elaborate schemes can be undone by a whisper in the wrong ear. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Berlin Tunnel is its symbolism. It stands as a monument to the hidden layers of history, to the unseen struggles that shaped the world we live in today. Just as the city of Berlin was split above ground, so too was it carved below, a mirror of the greater division of East and West. The tunnel reminds us that beneath every political confrontation lies a hidden story, a network of secrets and shadows that rarely come to light. Today, the tunnel is long gone, collapsed into the earth, remembered only through archives and photographs. But the questions it raises endure. How far should nations go in pursuit of security? What is the cost of secrets, and who pays it? And in a world still haunted by espionage, cyber warfare, and clandestine operations, how different are we from the divided city of Berlin? In the end, the Berlin Tunnel is more than history. It is a parable. A city beneath a city, a war beneath a war, a reminder that in the struggle between powers, the most decisive battles are often invisible. And in those battles, victory and defeat are never clear, only buried, waiting to be unearthed.